Hello, everyone. I'm Bill Squadron, President of Our Energy Policy, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar on the really essential issue of responsible mining when it comes to critical minerals. This is part of a year-long series that Our Energy Policy and the Earthshot Foundation are conducting to really dive deeply into what is absolutely crucial part of the energy transition, and that is the availability of critical minerals for numerous parts of the energy landscape. We have an excellent panel today, and we're going to get to them in just a minute. I do want to remind all of you attending that at the last part of the session, we will get to your questions. So please type them in and submit them, and we'll get to as many of your questions as we possibly can before we wrap up after an hour and let everybody get on their way at that point. So thanks again for joining. I do also want to point out that for those of you interested in reading more about this issue, the Our Energy Library, which is on the OEP website, has numerous materials, reports, papers, studies on this issue. I encourage all of you to take advantage of that resource that OEP provides. And of course, I want to thank all of our partners for supporting generally the OEP efforts, but in particular, this series is a cooperative venture between the Earthshot Foundation and Our Energy Policy, and we're very grateful to the Earthshot Foundation for all of its support, resources, and work in undertaking this initiative with us. So with that, I'm going to ask our panelists to join us, and we're going to jump right into the conversation. I'm going to give a quick introduction. It won't do justice to the amazing careers that all of these folks have had, but it'll allow us to dive into the conversation a little bit more quickly. First, Michael Rowley, who is the CEO of Stillwater Critical Minerals and a co-founder. He has spent more than 25 years in exploration, mining, around the mining and environmental industries, and has worked on financial markets, operations, one of the nation's experts in this area. Secondly, Judy Brown from the global mining company, South 32. Judy handles external affairs for South 32 in their work in the Americas. South 32 operates mining activities throughout the globe, many continents. And so Judy has long experience in this field, including having worked in external affairs at Rio Tinto before joining South 32. So thank you for joining us, Judy. Next, Amy Boulanger, who is the Executive Director of the Institute for Responsible Mining Assurance, IRMA, which is the leading, in fact, the standard for responsible mining. It's the world's most comprehensive definition of environmental and social responsibility in mining. Amy has spent 25 years working on mining issues, and particularly how they directly affected communities. So thank you for joining us today, Amy. And finally, Steve Feldgus, who joins us from the Department of Interior. Steve is the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Land and Minerals Management at the Department of Interior. And prior to that, was the Deputy Staff Director on Capitol Hill for the House Subcommittee on Energy and Natural Resources. So has spent many years working on these issues. So we have a fantastic group, and we're going to get right into it. And I think really to set the table, Steve, I'm going to turn to you first, just to ask you to give a little bit of an overview on what are the principal issues that require focus when it comes to responsible mining, whether it's environmental issues, social issues, community issues. If you can kind of lay out what are at the top of the list of things that the Department of Interior and all of us working in this space should be concerned about.
Sure thing, Bill, and thanks for the invite. Thanks for having me here today. At the Department of the Interior, we're primarily focused on reviewing mine proposals for how they're going to impact the land. So the public lands that are managed by BLM, what does that proposal do in terms of land use, in terms of impacts on the ground, impacts to wildlife? This is part of a whole suite of different agencies that are interested in various different components of the mining operations. So you've got usually state agencies, but also potentially EPA looking at clean air. You've got the Army Corps of Engineers looking at impacts to water. You've got the Bureau of Land Management looking at basically everything that the mine proposal would do. Also a lot of interest in, as you mentioned, the cultural factors, social factors. What are the impacts going to be on local communities? What are impacts on cultural resources? The National Historic Preservation Act is very important in terms of making sure that we know what is on a site and whether or not we're going to disturb any important cultural sites or burial sites or anything there. Obviously, the Endangered Species Act is really important, and knowing whether or not a mine proposal is going to impact any potential threatened or endangered species. And one of the things I've done in my role here at DOI is help to lead the interagency working group on mining laws, regulations, and permitting. And we put out a report last September containing 65 recommendations for how to improve the mining system here in the United States. And that runs the gamut from environmental issues to social issues to permitting process, and covers a lot of these issues that I've just discussed and a lot more that hopefully we'll have some more time to get into. But one of the things I'll say is that in the US, we have a very good framework of environmental regulations. All right, we have very good protections for air, for water, for waste, and so on. We do not nearly have as good of a system for looking at social impacts. NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act process, does a little bit of that. It does not do it nearly to the extent that is required in certain other jurisdictions. And it also comes very late in our mining process, and that can cause a lot of friction between the mining proponent and local communities that are going to be impacted. So that's sort of just an overview there, and hopefully we'll get to touch on some more of these points as we go on.
No, that's very helpful. Thanks. And your point about environmental and social impacts, we'll get to the social impacts a little bit later. Let's focus for a moment on the environmental impacts, and maybe Judy, you can start us off on this. I mean, as your company, other mining companies look at how to minimize the environmental impacts and consider, what the environmental footprint is going to be of a particular project. I mean, how do you all look at it, and what are the ways in which you can address these issues?
Well, I mean, one way that you can address the issues, we have to be honest about that, is when you're building new mines, because you can bake in sort of a sustainable approach to the development of a greenfield project. It's a little bit trickier with legacy sites where you're really sort of retroactively trying to, change designs from, 50 or maybe in some cases 100 years ago, and that can be a little bit complex. I mean, obviously, I think community acceptance has a lot to do with the environmental impact. And so in order to be successful today, I think you really have to be able to address those issues. I mean, one thing that we've done at Hermosa, which is our project in Arizona, is tried to minimize the footprint. And there are many ways that you can minimize the footprint. One of them is by going underground. One of them is by doing dry stack tailings. And many other things. And basically, obviously, it's visually impactful. But also there's a lot of other things like mining waste, and mining waste frankly takes up a lot of room. So anything that you can do to minimize the waste and sort of the safety aspects of mining waste, I think is critical to be successful in mining.
Yeah, and I know, Michael, your company does a lot of work in Montana. I mean, how do you all look at, when it comes to biodiversity, water issues, land issues, trying to minimize those impacts, and including, the waste point that Judy just made, which is obviously a major part of it?
Sure. Well, we're not producing, of course. We are the largest nickel resource in an active district, but we look to our neighbor, Sibanye, who have set really good precedents in that regard. In fact, until recently, they were the most recently permitted mine in Montana with their East Boulder mine. They did that by understanding the local community and the concerns and recognizing those environmental concerns. They put, I believe, 50% of their tailings back underground, which is, Judy touched on that as an important way of minimizing surface impact. They also have a good neighbor agreement in place by which they audit the water quality with a third party trusted outsider, much the same way you'd audit financials. And this gives comfort that environmental standards being met, there is no impact to the mine, and we're simply following in that good example locally. Bigger picture, there's all kinds of things that mining can do in the modern age. I was just at the Berkeley pit last week, and I'm impressed with the metal recovery they're looking from the Berkeley pit water, and that's an excellent example of remediation with recovery, frankly. There's metals in the water, so benefit from that. And this is mining being progressive and applying new technologies in cleanup.
Yeah. I mean, Amy, let me turn to you, because IRMA, of course, has set standards, and I'm sure that you all have, kind of seen a range of efforts by mining companies in the U.S. and throughout the world doing their best to comply. I mean, as you all see it, where are the biggest challenges in terms of both efforts to comply, and even where it's a complete effort, that the technology is really not there to be able to achieve the kind of goals that we may set out?
Well, Bill, I mean, I think first of all, I'm always excited about evolution in technology. I'm really excited to see what 20 more years of thinking about how we can do mining with less harm, what that will bring. But I'll say right now, it's very achievable to do industrial scale mining with a lot less impact and harm. The biggest barrier, honestly, has not been the technology. It's been either laws that require it, because most companies are going to operate to legal compliance where they are. So laws that require it, and markets that differentiate for companies that do less harm and have better benefit sharing with communities. I mean, so when you look at the impacts around a site on the environment, as Steve said, it's going to be water, and it's going to be the massive amount of waste it takes to get to these materials. And while these are materials that most of us are using every day, most people don't know much about it, and that we are so far from the mine. And the things we're walking around using that come from mines don't look much like the mine or what the material looked like when it left it. And so there's not the same consciousness on it. So it's really operated out of the public eye for so long that it lacked some of the drivers for pushing for better practices. But unless you were a community who lived right near one, or you were a worker, then you knew the name of these companies, right? And you knew what was happening there. So what we've really needed, I agree, like, shout out to Steve and the important work he's doing there. And the US has better laws than most, but I consistently say there's not a country in the world with laws sufficient to yet prevent significant harm where mining's happening, unless the companies who are there are really putting that effort in. And the work that Steve does is always going to be more important than the work we do, because we have a voluntary initiative. And Steve's work is setting the rules that everyone needs to follow. But we really hope that those laws will strengthen and improve, and that we can bring positive market attention to the companies who step up to that, because otherwise we are also looking at stats like half of Western watersheds in the United States have some amount of mining pollution in them. We have a number of places where we have abandoned mines, where we have taxpayers cleaning them up, or looking at centuries of maintenance around water and waste at these sites. How do we make sure that's not the next generation of mines? Is like, we need to set up the laws and the market structures to incentivize that. And that's really what we're looking toward.
Yeah. And Steve, you
Add
mentioned
to that, if you don't mind, Bill, that
please.
those are excellent words, Amy. I think the incentivization is coming and it's in place, and I was encouraged to see that in action in Montana recently. But you're absolutely right. These are ultimately market commodities, and people will buy from the cheapest source.
That's true.
Other countries are flooding the market with less environmentally friendly, less humanitarianly friendly material, they may just buy there. So you're absolutely right about regulation, and in the push to onshore and look to recycle, it may also take government incentives, which thankfully the US government is really shining at right now in the global space.
Yeah, I mean, so Steve, I mean, you mentioned 65 recommendations, but there are any, it sounds like from what Michael and Amy just said, that the US is really one of the leaders in having strong codes and laws? I mean, are there any particular ones of those recommendations that you think are particularly noteworthy in terms of strengthening where we currently stand?
Well, I'll say one thing about our strong environmental standards, and that is it's really a patchwork of different laws. And it is not a coherent law designed to explain how to develop a mine and how to permit a mine as safely and as environmentally responsibly as possible. You're working under the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act and all these other laws. And that's one of the reasons why permitting can be complex in the United States, because we have this sort of non-holistic way of getting approvals. So a lot of the recommendations that we make are not so much on the we need to strengthen this particular water standard. We do recommend, for example, requiring mines to adhere to the global standard on tailings management that just came out a few years ago, because we think we can improve on our tailings work a little bit. But what really needs to be fixed is the entire process of how people get mining claims in this country, and then how they go from that and move towards development of a mine. Because it's not a very simple process, and a lot of it has to do with a 150-year-old law, 150-plus-year-old law that we're still working under. It's still the 1872 mining law out there that operates on the ground. So I think when it comes to the ways we need to update, and we were just talking about abandoned mine lands. I think Amy mentioned like that problem. That is a huge issue, not just for the direct environmental impact that it has on tons of communities throughout the West and tribal nations and the wildlife, but also for the impression of the mining industry that it provides. Because people live with these abandoned mine sites and they have the impression that this is still a 19th century mining industry. And companies like Sibanye are doing great stuff, like Michael said, through the Good Neighbor Agreement. And there are great ways to rebuild that trust and to make communities, well, just, more confident that they're not going to have some abandoned mine site that's going to be leaching acidic drainage into their water for generations. But we do have recommendations to raise the regulations so that we can help build that trust with communities and help, lower the conflict level in a lot of these mines.
Bill, if you don't mind me building on what Steve said there, and I love what you just said, Steve, and this patchwork and where do we fill in? I mean, this is really a place where the environmental and the social and the legal structure and the patches that are in it right now, those holes in the patchwork are so key. I mean, a big piece of that, because so many of these materials are on tribal lands, indigenous lands, within 35 miles of a native reservation here in the US. And of course, globally, about 50% of energy transition materials are estimated to be on or adjacent to indigenous peoples' lands. Then you really have the fact that responding to the climate crisis and other uses of transition minerals and mining and indigenous rights are intricately connected. And you have indigenous people saying, look, we've traded in our minerals for millennia. We'll continue to do so, but we want to do it on our terms, and we don't want it to be a trade of loss of our waters and lands and cultural heritage in order to quote unquote save the planet, right? We want to make sure that if we're providing materials and we're going to be the bank account of natural resources, it's done in a way where we see the benefits of that, we don't see long-term harm, and we have free, prior, informed consent, as the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People lay out. So, in the US, when you take it straight to places like Montana or Nevada or California or Arizona, and the work that Judy is doing, the work that Michael's doing, Sibanye Stillwater, who we've mentioned, I mean, we're really looking at what is also the relationship that Native people in the US have had with this 500 years of extraction. When we go in and talk about lithium or platinum or copper now, it's not without those centuries of gold behind us, of the impacts of that. And indigenous people are right to ask the hard questions right now, because the US is not currently a signatory to UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And so they're saying, what evidence do we have to think it's going to be done differently in the future? And I think that that's a great question to ask. And I think companies, there are leading companies now who are stepping up to answer that in new ways.
So let's drill down a little bit more on the points, Amy, that you and Steve just made, which, really gets to communicating with affected communities, making them, more aware of what the current state is, as opposed to, Steve, as you said, these abandoned mines, 1872 laws, things that people may have in their mind. I mean, what is the approach? Maybe I'll turn to Michael, to Judy. What is the approach that you all take when you are starting a project or expanding a project in terms of working with the community? And what have you found is most effective in achieving success in those efforts?
Was that to Judy, or to me?
Well, I say Michael, Judy, either one of you. Just
Well, I'll start as the junior, and then I'll let the senior take it. We exist in the capital markets to raise risk money, and as perhaps the only one on this panel, we have to go in early with an early stage project and try to understand the community and their concerns. And it's all done. You're not sure of what the mine looks like at this point. You're not even perhaps sure if you even have a deposit. You start with very little impact, and that has to be understood. And that's the education piece that Steve and Amy in particular have done a good job enunciating. Really from there, it's understanding the local community, and it takes years. Ideally, you're on the ground with local people. That helps me a lot to have local insight of someone who knows the community. And then you build. I mean, we've been 7 years on the ground at Stillwater now. We've got a good idea of the local community, good idea of their concerns. Elsewhere, up in Canada, we've had projects, and I'm proud to say I know the First Nations chiefs myself. We're still friends on our cell phones. And it took a good 6 months or a year to really understand what their individual concerns were. For one nation, it was heritage sites. For another, it was environmental. You can work with that once you understand what it is. From there, you're building out, raising risk capital and de-risking a project. And all of this requires some degree of certainty, because otherwise that risk capital will go somewhere else. We're always balancing all these different elements. Is that a good setup, Judy?
Sorry, my computer shut down and now I've restarted, so I apologize. I don't actually know where we are, but it was a fantastic setup wherever we are.
Well, no, it was I'll vouch for the fact it was a great setup, but your experiences, Judy, in working with local communities, and what has typically been the approach that you take in broad strokes, but also where are the challenges? I mean, it's obviously a very potentially fraught area, and how have you all dealt with it? What do you think works best? And as you look forward, what do you recommend as the kind of best approach in working on this?
Well, I mean, obviously early engagement is key. I think anything that you can do to shape the project based on that input from the community is key. And you can only do that with really early engagement. Actually, I think it's the same with tribal partners. You have to engage with them very early. I think we talked, previously in a former conversation about how one of the issues with NEPA and some of the regulations in the US don't really allow for that early engagement, because it's a government to government relationship. Unless there's a regulatory sort of action in front of agencies, they don't really engage on behalf of your project until that regulatory process begins. So obviously the company can early engage, but at the end of the day, your permit is sort of reliant on the quality of the government engagement, which isn't set up for early engagement. So that is one of the issues. I'd say we're working on a good neighbor agreement now. And I do think that could be a good practice in terms of codifying and legally requiring some of the community expectations that they want, versus the sort of, I'll take your word for it, that we're going to address these issues. And that independent monitoring, I was involved in the Eagle project in Michigan, where they do independent monitoring for the community. That's been successful. It's not always super comfortable, I think, for the companies to do that, but you do have to find a way through that process. And really, it's just getting the data at the same time, and then also The other thing, we do this in Colombia, where we do share all of the environmental data with the community, but there's a capacity issue. So the other thing is you have to hire people, independent people, to interpret the data and tell people what they mean. Because, massive amounts of spreadsheets on air monitoring data doesn't really mean much unless you also hire the capability and the capacity for people to tell them what this means and what's happening.
Yeah.
If I can build on, oh, sorry, Bill.
No, go, Amy.
I was going to say, to Judy's point there, one, she just completely hit on something that I love that's in the Siboney Stillwater Good Neighbor Agreement in Montana that I think is fantastic, which is it's legally binding, their agreement. So it goes above Montana law, it goes above federal law, and yet it's still legally binding for them to follow it. So the community can have this trust that's going to be followed, or there'll be legal consequences. And then also that the company funds the community to have a watchdog group on the company. So it's not just funding basketball uniforms or the other good things that companies can contribute to and sponsor, but they fund the community to have a watchdog group, including funds for the community to hire their own PhD scientists to read through those water quality data, air quality data, look at mine waste that Steve spoke of earlier. And that really means then you can have people speaking on the same technical level, some who are working with the company, some who are advocates to the community. And it just not only does it make for a better run mine and less harm happening there, but just the temperature level of conflict goes down because there's a greater sense that we're all represented well here and we're talking about the same issues and we understand each other. It's really powerful. So I'm glad you brought that up.
I don't see it as being rocket science either, because it's the same thing we do with our financial statements, right? We want to audit companies for a reason, and it's fundamentally trust, independence, good judgment, good management. Apply the same thinking to water quality. It makes, within reason, it makes a lot of sense.
And I'll certainly reinforce the value of having that independent technical expertise. I think it's the same way you wouldn't want to be as an individual investor trying to pour through all of these annual reports from companies, but you might go to a financial advisor who has already done that and can give you advice. Same thing with mining. You don't want to have to pour through the environmental documents, but you would like someone who knows what they're looking at to go through that and tell you whether or not things are being done in alignment with the permit or agreements or whatever is done. But I wanted to follow up also on something that Judy said about sort of the government to government relationship versus the sort of the private company to tribal relationship. And she's absolutely right in that our formal engagement with tribes starts much later in the life cycle of mine development than you would want it to. Right? It is true that until a company submits a plan of operations to actually develop a mine or maybe a large exploration plan, we're not going to do any outreach to tribes or communities to see how they feel about this, to do that formal consultation. However, the company, in this long lead up until when they submit their plan, they need to be doing that outreach. They need to be talking with the communities. And it's much easier when it gets to us. If a company brings us a mine plan that has the support of the community and the impacted tribes, then even though our consultation doesn't happen until very late in the process, by the time we get there, a lot of the issues have been resolved. They've had a chance to work through with the tribe, with the community, and figure out how to modify things to take care of issues. If you wait until the end of this and you wait and figure, well, the government will take care of that at the end, then it might be too late. You might not be able to modify your plan at that point, or you'll have allowed so much opposition to build up that there's no trust and there'll be opposition to your mine regardless of what you're willing to do at that point.
See, let me ask you a little bit about that. And I also want to remind our audience, if you do have questions, be sure to submit them in writing. We'll get to your questions shortly. But Steve, would it be better? I mean, it sounds like everyone's saying in a sense it would, if the sort of third party in the triangle, the government, could be in that interaction earlier rather than coming in later. I mean, I think everybody probably subscribes to your excellent point that the earlier companies can interact with the community and build trust and build a relationship is great. But, does there need to be regulatory or legislative changes that would allow the government to become part of those conversations earlier?
Well, some of it doesn't need to be actual new regulations or new law. It's just practices that we can do that are better at informing people than we currently have. So right now on BLM land, if you want to go out and drill a few exploration holes, as long as you're disturbing less than 5 acres of land, you're not following a formal plan. You're just sending BLM what's called a notice and giving them a basic idea of what you're going to be doing. BLM will review that, but they don't formally approve it. And because it's not an approval, there's no NEPA, there's no ESA, there's no notification that this work is going to be happening. So typically what happens is the company will just send their notice. They only have to wait 15 days. If they don't get BLM holding up a stop sign, they can go out there and start drilling. And before anyone in the community knows what's going on, what the plan is, who the company is. So what we're doing is working on improving our communications at that step. In particular, letting tribes that might be impacted know when there's a mining notice near an area that they care about. We're very close to rolling out this as an official policy throughout BLM. It's something that, you know, it's a small start because it doesn't really, you know, there are a lot of tribes that might have interests in areas that we don't know about. This is limited to the tribes that we know that care, but we are hoping to, over the long run, build an automated system where tribes can indicate on a map the areas they want to be notified about. And then whenever there's a new exploration notice in that area, they get an automatic notification that a company is planning to do work there, and then they can go and talk to that company. Ideally, the company would also know that there's a tribe that cares about this area, and they can do that outreach. So yes, I think there is a role in government in making this process easier. The real engagement has to occur between the company and the tribe or the community, but the government can do a better part in facilitating that.
Can I use an anecdote example? And it's actually related to the Forest Service. So it's not BLM or the Department of Interior, Steve, don't worry. But we did like over, 25,000 acres of cultural resource surveys across the Forest Service and across our private lands. And we handed those over to the Forest Service, but we were only allowed to share with the tribes the private land cultural resource surveys because the Forest Service didn't want to share the federal land cultural resource survey. So that's one example of where it became sort of awkward, where you have sort of 3 parties sort of not working in concert or not working in the same way. And to some extent, they were uncomfortable that we were sharing our private land cultural resource surveys because they weren't ready to. But obviously from our own investor standpoint, we were like, well, we're not going to wait, and we're going to start this engagement now. So I do think that there's, I don't know, maybe some, that work on sort of federal lands, if there's a way to sort of be more transparent, because really it's the property of the government, even though the work was done by South 32. But I don't know, there may be a way for like early transparency, maybe even if it isn't engagement.
Yeah, I'll say that something that could be improved. I mean, there are definitely things like that. And one of the things I think that could be improved is protecting tribal knowledge. A lot of times we have tribes that are very resistant or refuse to hand over information about sacred sites or cultural resources, because if they're with the government, it's tougher for the government to then protect them from FOIA or lawsuits or whatever we need. So some sort of protection for tribal information could be very useful in terms of getting them to turn over information earlier so we have a better idea of where we need to look and protect.
I always think with so much talk, there's been so much talk about how do we get permits to move faster in the US and streamlining permitting. That makes a lot of communities where mining happens anxious, rightly so. They're like, are you going to jam through things that are going to impact us and our lands? And they're pushing back, and it adds to all of this conflict that's in America. And I often think if you want to move these permits more efficiently forward, and Steve, I heard you on another recent webinar where you mentioned the US is moving them faster than many other places are. But I say if you want more efficient permitting, there's 3 things we need to do. One, and they go to what Judy just said, but we need agencies staffed well enough to have enough staff and expertise, well-funded agencies, well-staffed with expertise to do the work that we're asking them to do increasingly right now. 2 is the transparency. Let's have that out there. There's a lot of anxiety about what's going on behind the curtain and who's influencing whom. So let's have transparency in how decisions are being made in the agencies. And 3 is expectation for mining companies, they come forward to bring best practice designs, really strongly well-designed things that are going to reduce harm, that have this community support by the time they bring it in. Because bringing a really shoddy proposal that has a ton of conflict around it, where there isn't good baseline studies on the biodiversity or on cultural heritage, is fodder for 10 years of litigation and fighting between people, because people are afraid, right? So being really clear to mining companies, this is what you should have ready when you come. They go to an agency that's well-funded and staffed with experts, and a transparency on the process. That will move things faster than trying to waive a bunch of environmental laws that we actually really need for our long-term future.
And I add something to that. I mean, I obviously think there's not a risk of litigation, there's a certainty of litigation, and that is regardless of whether you have the best permit in the world buttoned up. I mean, you're obviously better off in litigation, but at the end of the day, you're going to get, you'd be very naive to not put that into your permitting timeline at this point. But I will say that resourcing and capacity and capability are a big issue. So I think there's a lot of education that needs to be, there's a lot of talk about streamlining permits, but it really doesn't skip any steps. I mean, a lot of streamlining permits is really about better coordination. It isn't about skipping important steps. And I think there's just a lack of resources and a lack of education. We're building a mine in a non-mining county in Arizona, and it's also 85% ESL. So we had to do like a whole citizen's guide to NEPA, and we had to translate that into Spanish because people are really wary of processes that they don't understand. And so I think the NEPA, we got a lot of comments that even though it was only commenting on scoping, they wanted it to be extended 90 days, which there's really no need, because there's really nothing, you don't really need that much time for that. But a lot of it is just because they didn't really understand the NEPA process, and we needed to educate them. And there also needs to be better resourcing. And I think we're always in this awkward position where we're creating work for overworked people because we want to build a mine. And so, to some extent, you have to work together to try and figure out how are you going to get that capability and expertise. And that it's just this tense relationship of you want things to move faster. And a lot of the reasons they move slow is really a capacity and resourcing issue.
Yeah, and as you just referred, Judy, to the almost inevitability of litigation. I mean, one thing that's come perfectly clear in the Earthshot OEP series is that, our need for minerals is going to grow exponentially if we don't want to be dependent on particularly foreign entities of concern, and at least have more control. There's going to be a need for more mining. There are people who are just going to be opposed to it. So how do you deal with a situation where a company does everything possible to get out in front, is communicative, is transparent, but people are just, for whatever reasons, opposed to the concept? I mean, what is the way of dealing with those kinds of situations? And I throw that out really to all of you.
Well, I will say I think accepting the fact that you're certainly going to be litigated, I think helps you with your approach, because I think that allows you to take certain risks. So, you know what I mean? If you have an overly legal approach, especially when you're talking about community engagement or tribal engagement, because you're worried about your eventual litigation, I don't think you're going to get very far or get a very good work product. I think you just have to accept the fact that you're going to be litigated, and that hopefully the review and actually it's not you that's being litigated, it's the agency. Right, so it's the government that's being sued, not the company, in essence. So it just sort of incentivizes you to have to work together to make sure that your record. I mean, one thing we've done is we've hired the person that's going to do our litigation at the very beginning, even before we ever submitted our mine plan of operation, so that they can be involved in the entire building of the record. So that, that we make sure that all of the T's are crossed and all of the I's are dotted all throughout the process, and then that strengthens. So, I mean, to me, it's just part of your permitting process.
That's what I see where we are too, and you're absolutely correct. It's they just have to be sure of transparency and that they've ticked all the boxes and that they're ready for that action. We landed on harmonizing of regulations as being central. I think that's a lot of what we're talking about here. Just be clear on the process and what's required, and tick the boxes and build it out. It is going to take studies, and you're absolutely correct that the regulators don't always have the bandwidth. We often have to bring in outside consultants. That's fine. It adds cost, it adds time. It has to be done correctly, especially in new areas. But understanding what it's going to be, start to finish, is central. I think Amy hit on that point really well. harmonizing that regulation is the best way to shorten the overall process, end the noise and the infighting, and just have a really thorough but streamlined process would be the ideal. And that might take bringing back the Bureau of Mines. I know it's been talked about increasingly. It may be something like that. If it could be done without adding a new layer of complexity to an already complex system, maybe something like that is the answer to harmonizing this and streamlining it effectively while still doing quality work.
I think the key missing point I see here, though, I think litigation comes because communities are afraid, and they have a lot of material on which to base that fear, right? Every time, I mean, the very fact that IRMA has the phrase responsible mining in our title means that there are some mining affected communities and their advocates who distrust what we do as something that's going to be greenwashing, even though we're trying to change that and create value for more responsible practices. But the truth is, it's really difficult when we don't have a lot of examples of mines where communities are saying, this was a great advantage to our community, and it was a great advantage over the long term. We didn't give up long-term economic opportunities. We didn't give up our cultural heritage. We didn't give up clean water or our grazing lands, but too often that story is the inverse, and it's the flip, and it's 7 generations of harm. And that's why we walk into litigation each time, is that we're lacking these examples of where mining really is bringing prosperity, and prosperity that's not a trade-off for a bunch of other things that are real priorities to them. So I think, you have companies, including in the US, who are really trying to shift that dynamic, but it's not, I would say it's not as much by preparing for litigation as it is by answering that fear and saying, we're going to do true benefit sharing, which includes profit sharing. You've got companies like Albemarle, which are proposing a new mine in the US, but are doing 3.5% of their sales in direct profit sharing to the 18 Atacameno indigenous communities in Chile. Like, that's different. I don't know tribal communities in the US that are getting a before profit sales percentage back for mining on their lands. I don't know that many places where the mining company is funding the community to hire their own PhD researchers. I mean, I think if we can take the power structure that's been viewed as inequitable and the outcomes, we've got a lot of mining coming to rural communities who want jobs. They appreciate jobs that are for community members who don't have college degrees, that bring living wage and benefits to them. So I think they want jobs like this, but they don't want it at the risk of clean water and cultural heritage.
I mean, I completely agree with you, Amy, but I think we can't be naive about the fact that this is at least in the US, an extremely litigious society. And so I do think that there are legitimate concerns by the community. And I do think that, to some extent, I think the litigation is probably a good way of being able to defend your permit. So I'm not saying that litigation is bad, but I don't think that there's a whole ecosystem of litigiousness in the US that isn't necessarily directly related to your relationship with the community.
Amy mentioned an example earlier. I wonder if that is part of the recipe for sort of strengthening progress in this area, which is, there's often a lot of talk about how we've communicated early, we've traded a lot of information, but you mentioned an example where there was actually something put in a contract where it was, there was an agreement and it was much more buttoned down, and I suppose probably can avoid a lot of the finger pointing later. I mean, is that something that can be a model for what can improve situations going forward, where actually things get documented, the contributions are clearer and more substantive? Is that something of a roadmap?
It is. I mean, it was a roadmap for the IRMA standard. The IRMA standard for responsible mining that is now applicable globally. I mean, we used the Stillwater Good Neighbor Agreement as a template when we started and integrated that, but then built on to even more that we saw could be done there. But it can definitely be replicated. And I'll pop in the chat actually a link to it. There's a link that's both the company's link to that agreement and then also what are nonprofit environmental groups in Montana saying about it, because they both have a story on it that supports this idea.
I think our Good Neighbor Agreement negotiations, it's really helpful for us because we're in a county where the small town that is most affected by the mine is mostly retirees. And they have like ecotourism and environmental and impact and traffic. I mean, they're the most impacted. They have very much concerns, but then the larger county is, extremely young. Average age is like 30, and they all want jobs, and it's, heavily Hispanic. It's a border town in Arizona. I mean, they have very different needs. And so the Good Neighbor Agreement, having a legal agreement with the 3 municipal entities within the county, City of Nogales, Patagonia, and Santa Cruz County, is really helpful because there's so many needs to address to be able to put them all in one. And what we found is that like Patagonia has actual concerns that they haven't really thought of, that the Santa Cruz County is much more concerned with. And so then they share in the benefits of the agreements that we're negotiating because they hadn't thought about that. So, to some extent, all the municipal entities are benefiting from a Good Neighbor Agreement in terms of not just focused on the issues that they care about the most, but actually expanding their view of what the issues are. I think the trickiest part is what Amy referred to earlier, which is that how do you make them have sort of skin in the game, and how do you have some sort of equity sharing, value sharing? How do you create true value? And that's not only difficult for the communities, but it's also difficult for companies, right? I mean, they're not putting in the investment, but here you are, tying them into some of the profit and some of the benefit. But I mean, that is sort of, that's kind of the way of the world, and the way that it's going is they have to be invested in this as well.
We're going to get to questions in just a minute or two, but Steve, following up on that, I mean, you had mentioned right at the beginning that the regulations, guidelines in the environmental side were a little bit stronger than the social and community interaction kind of area. Where do you think improvement could be made in terms of the government's involvement in facilitating a good process that involves the community and gets all the questions answered in a way that's acceptable to people?
Yeah, I mean, there are several things that you can do. And one of the things is trying to requiring companies to enter into these sorts of agreements, whether it's a good neighbor agreement or a community benefit agreement or something along those lines. This is something that's required in Canada. Mining companies need to engage in negotiations with the First Nations and try to come to some sort of community benefit agreement. That is not a requirement in the US. However, it is becoming more common in a lot of government grant opportunities. For example, the Department of Energy requires a lot of community benefit agreements to be submitted along with grant applications for a number of their funding programs. And it's something that we also ask of our offshore wind lessees. We can give them a bidding credit if they submit an agreement that they've made with the local communities that might be impacted by the development. So there can also be actually that's two ways. So that's an incentive in one way, and Canada has a requirement. So there's a lot of different ways that you could make this more of the norm rather than the exception. But also when it comes to negotiating these agreements, you have a lot of communities. I would say most communities and most tribes don't really know much about negotiating this. And they don't know what goes into that, what the possible outcomes are. And we need to provide, whether it's the government, industry, or third party, someone needs to provide more assistance to these communities to help them actually negotiate these agreements and understand what they can get out of it. This is another thing that Canada does, I think, a lot better than the United States. There are entities like the First Nations Major Project Coalition, which deals with all infrastructure, but they work with their First Nations to help them understand, how can you negotiate with companies to get the most positive benefits for your nation.
But what needs to be done to get us to just what you just described? I mean, is it this interagency group that needs to sign off? Is it something that needs to be an amendment to the law? Is it just having enough resources? I mean, how do we achieve the goal that you just set out?
I think for a lot of that, it's going to be potential legislation. I mean, there are just some things that we don't have the authority to require. I mean, we do look constantly at what our authority is, what additional regulations might we be able to propose that would push companies in that direction or incentivize this process. But a lot of times you would need some new legislation in order to provide any teeth to this or to actually give us the authority. One of the things, though, that we could use legislation on. For laying down the rules of the road would be tribal consultation, because a lot of the rules of tribal consultation are just through executive orders and department manuals and memos. And for a lot of both federal employees and companies, it's not always clear exactly what satisfies those obligations. So it would be good to have in legislation, this is one of our recommendations in the report, is to have legislative requirements for tribal consultation so that tribes were assured that they would get consulted, but then also companies would know, what do we need to do in order to meet this requirement? And that, I think, would also take away some of the uncertainty in the permitting process.
Great, thanks. We are going to get to questions in a second, I promise, but I did want to at least throw out to all of you, not that there are any silver bullets anywhere in the world, but I mean, are there any innovative techniques, approaches, technologies that you all see coming that can really make a very material impact, whether it's on waste management and disposal, whether it's on dealing with abandoned mines or water or land issues? I mean, just curious whether there's something in development, something you see on the horizon that might be a game changer.
I might jump in with two things we're doing at Stillwater. One is carbon sequestration. Ultramafic rocks have a natural capacity to bind carbon dioxide. That's compelling right there. Beyond just the rock type, there's all kinds of more active ways that you can direct capture carbon, perhaps even from a point source emitter, and put it in tailings, lock it away as a carbonate in geologic time. That's really interesting, and that actually gets the attention of tribal peoples, First Nations, the community in general. You're doing more than providing critical minerals, you're also decarbonizing, and you're providing a sink for carbon. Second is hydrogen production. A lot of interest in the US now on geologic hydrogen. Not the right forum for that, but that's another way that these rocks can be used to generate a carbon-friendly fuel, basically. And that's in addition to the innovations in resource recovery and mining of waste and tailings and such.
Thanks, Michael. All right, let's turn it over. Jordan, do we have questions from our audience?
Yeah, sure. I'll jump right in here. This is probably for Judy or Michael, but for the panel, certainly. Are there opportunities for collaboration and knowledge sharing to accelerate the adoption of sustainable mining practices across the industry?
Michael, you want to take that?
Yes, there are, definitely. And I'm encouraged by the growth of that in the US, and I'd be happy to follow up on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of industry sharing groups. I mean, there's ICMM. I mean, there's a lot of groups where industries do share, but I mean, at the end of the day, I think civil society type folks aren't involved. I don't know that it really, yeah, it's just it's a competitive environment. I mean, I don't, so
Sure.
I think unless you have that other sort of larger, which is probably why IRMA was, attractive in the first place, because they had Anglo-American and had civil society, and probably the big criticism of ICMM is this is great, but they don't have civil society represented. And so it can't just be an industry sharing.
And I think to Judy's point there, I mean, we're all talking a lot about both the structural pieces, but then all about this trust, and a lot of broken trust that sits in these spaces. And I've talked to a number of lithium companies who are dismayed, thinking like, look, we're trying to be part of energy transition. And it seems like environmental and social groups want there to be energy transition. Don't they see that lithium is part of this, or copper or nickel, et cetera, right, going into these materials? And they do, but they also look at it's not a fresh space, right? You're walking into a landscape and a whole set of landscapes where you've got these centuries of gold and other materials, uranium on indigenous lands, and what's left there. It took, decades and centuries to build a culture of distrust. It's going to take years to get to trust. And I'd argue that rather than prepping for litigation, prepping to create that value shift is like, communities are evaluating all the time. Do we want this new corporate headquarters coming here? Do we want this new factory? a processing plant in our community. And it's like, helping them see that the benefits will outweigh the risk and harm is really where mining needs to come in it. I think one great thing is that even as Steve is doing this good work to fill the patchwork quilt in laws, government does move slowly, and there's lots of dynamics there as the market can signal its expectation and creating value both for laws to be stronger, but also, you've got car makers, including 4 of the US, Ford, GM, Tesla, Rivian, have joined 3 of the European car makers saying, we want mines to be audited against best practice standard. We want them specifically to be audited against the IRMA standard. We want to see them be transparent about their current impacts and then also improve over time. I mean, that's tremendous to have the volume of the car sector, not just jewelry and electronics, who are important names, but they buy smaller things. But that volume buy says to the mining industry, look, we're linking back to you from end products that back, and we want to be associated with doing good for the communities where the raw materials come from. And that's a really powerful driver to change, I think, in this space.
Very well. I appreciate that feedback. Next question here. Can tribes essentially say no, regardless of what stage a mine is at in the process? And what does that look like?
Well, part of it depends on the location. So they could say no if it's on their reservation. Steve, or you're going to answer?
Yeah, I was just going to say that if it's on tribal lands, then yes, they have the say whether or not a project moves forward. But if it is on public lands, federal, whether BLM or Forest Service, and it just might impact the tribe, but won't necessarily be on their lands, then there's no sort of mechanism for them to say no. But the consultation process, and hopefully the early engagement process, is designed to understand their concerns and try to figure out how to minimize any negative impacts to those tribes.
And I'll say, I know Steve knows this, but just so that we say this, with a highlighter pen on it, reservation lands are a tiny percentage of what these tribes used as their lands, and they consider their lands, right? So the lands they used, for many generations in time immemorial, far exceed and go beyond the boundaries of the reservation. So they can say what happens here, but they may consider culturally significant and where their relatives are buried and places they've used and where they are grazing and their long-term economic future to be outside here. And yes, they have very little legal recourse and no requirement in this country for consent. Although even when you cross the border, there's a lot more opportunity in Canada, which is also a mining nation, which hands out permits and has a vibrant Indigenous community. They have adopted the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples just north of me here in British Columbia and looking at mining there. And they have the First Nations Mining and Energy Council of BC has a critical mineral strategy. So it's really an advanced conversation of what are the expectations, even as mining and Indigenous rights move forward.
I think one challenge, I totally agree with what Amy and Steve said. It's certainly, and like in Arizona, for example, the Hopi and Zuni consider the entire state of Arizona their cultural lands. And so, and most, a lot of Native American tribes live in reservations that aren't actually tied to their cultural land. So they were moved there. So I think part of the challenge is really on the whole idea of consent. And I know that there's definite, there's a big debate on what we mean by consent, but putting that aside for the moment, I think that the issue is to not just consult to get a permit, but how do you set up a consultation process with tribes that is more for the life of the mine? Because when you think about impacts, the impacts aren't just for construction and operation, they change over time. You have expansions, you have all kinds of other issues. So I think you have to set up a system where consultation is something that's part of your life cycle. It's not, there's no end game to the consultation. The consultation is ongoing for the entire project, if you will.
I would love to get to a few more of the questions, but we do guarantee people our 1 hour sort of time frame. And this has been such a fascinating conversation. We'd obviously could go on for a lot more time, but I would encourage everyone listening to do is, as I said at the beginning, we have many materials in the Our Energy Library if you would like to look at more, including very recent studies, reports, papers on this subject. Our fantastic panel, and thank you to Michael, Judy, Amy, Steve, participated in a workshop recently that the Earthshot Foundation, OEP, organized. We'll be publishing a white paper with the insights and observations and thoughts from that workshop shortly. That will be available in a few weeks. And on top of that, if you have colleagues, friends who would like to listen to the discussion today, the recording of this webinar will be on the OEP website. So I do want to thank once again OEP's partners, particularly the Earthshot Foundation, for their support. Our thanks to our outstanding panel for this discussion, and of course to all of you who took the time to be part of this. Encourage all of you, of course, to get more and more engaged in this really essential part of the energy ecosystem going forward as we work on all of these challenges. So thanks again to everyone. Have a great rest of the week, and we look forward to seeing you again shortly. Thank you very much.